The day began like any other on Route 47, a quiet stretch of highway winding through open countryside, where the occasional bird call was often the loudest sound of the morning. Officer Darren Brooks, a man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of duty, was behind the wheel of his patrol car. His reputation preceded him: strict, unyielding, and known for doing everything by the book. To Darren, every infraction, no matter how minor, deserved immediate attention. That morning, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Darren's routine patrol had so far been uneventful, save for a squirrel darting across the pavement and a lone jogger on the shoulder. He adjusted his rear-view mirror and sighed. This highway didn't see much action, but Darren prided himself on staying alert. Complacency, in his eyes, was the first step toward chaos. He was just about to turn onto a side road when he noticed it, a massive, battered truck sitting idle on the shoulder up ahead. Its faded blue paint was peeling, revealing rusted patches underneath. The vehicle was positioned awkwardly, with its rear end jutting slightly into the lane. To Darren, it was an accident waiting to happen. "What now?" he muttered under his breath, flipping on his lights. The red and blue strobes cut through the stillness, their reflection glinting off the truck's side mirrors. Darren pulled over a few yards behind the vehicle and stepped out of his car. The crunch of his boots on gravel was the only sound as he approached. Leaning casually against the hood of the truck was its driver. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture relaxed, as though he had all the time in the world. He wore a weathered baseball cap pulled low, casting a shadow over his face. His arms were crossed, and a faint smile played at the corners of his lips, as if he found something about the situation amusing. Darren's brow furrowed. To him, this was a blatant act of negligence. "What do you think you're doing here?" Darren barked, his tone sharp and authoritative. The man straightened up, his movements unhurried. "Just giving the engine a rest, officer," he said, his voice calm and even. Darren's eyes narrowed. "You're blocking traffic, and that's a hazard," he snapped. "This is a highway, not a parking lot. Move it now, or I'll have it towed." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering Darren's words. Then he smiled again, a calm, almost knowing smile that only irritated Darren further. "With all due respect, officer, I'm not blocking traffic. The road's clear as far as the eye can see." He gestured toward the empty stretch of highway. "Nobody's been by in the last half hour." Darren's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for excuses, especially not from someone who seemed so unconcerned. "That's not the point," he said firmly. "The law's the law, and you're in violation. Now, license and registration." The man sighed, reaching into the cab of the truck. Darren's hand instinctively moved to his holster, his eyes trained on the driver's every move. Years on the force had taught him to trust no one completely. The man re-emerged with a worn leather wallet and handed over his papers without a word. Darren took them, his eyes scanning the documents. "Jack Roberts," he read aloud, filing the name away in his mind. The license looked legitimate, and the registration checked out, but Darren's suspicion lingered. Something about Jack's demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. "Wait here," Darren ordered, turning on his heel and heading back to his patrol car. Sliding into the driver's seat, he placed the documents on the dashboard and pulled up his onboard computer. As he typed in Jack's information, his thoughts churned. "Who does this guy think he is?" Darren muttered. "Sitting there like he owns the place." The screen blinked to life, displaying Jack's record. Darren's eyes scanned the entries, expecting to find unpaid tickets or a history of reckless behavior. Instead, the file was clean. Too clean, in Darren's opinion. A man driving a beat-up truck like that usually had some kind of history. With nothing suspicious to go on, Darren exhaled sharply and stepped out of the car. As he approached the truck again, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small patch sewn onto the sleeve of Jack's jacket. It was faded and frayed, but the insignia was unmistakable. Darren's pace slowed as he took in the details. Could it be? Mr. Roberts, Darren began, his tone less confrontational now, mind telling me where you're headed? Jack shrugged, his expression unreadable. Just passing through, he said simply. Darren's gaze lingered on the patch. He'd seen one like it before, years ago, on the uniform of a fellow officer who had served overseas. His curiosity piqued, Darren decided to press further. That's an interesting patch you've got there, he said, nodding toward Jack's sleeve. Military. Jack glanced down at his arm, his lips curving into a faint smile. Something like that, he replied, his tone nonchalant. Darren's suspicion deepened. Who was this guy, really? And why was he being so evasive? Darren's instincts told him there was more to Jack Roberts than met the eye. But for now, all he had was a man with a clean record and a truck that was technically parked legally. All right, Darren said finally, handing back the documents. But if you're still here in 10 minutes, I'm calling for a tow. Jack nodded, his expression calm. Understood, officer. Have a good day. Darren walked back to his car, glancing over his shoulder one last time. Jack was already leaning against the hood again, as relaxed as ever. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't seeing. Something important. As he sat in his patrol car, the question gnawed at him, who was Jack Roberts? The driver stepped forward, revealing his tall, broad-shouldered frame. He wore a worn denim jacket with patches on the elbows and dark, oil-stained jeans. His face was mostly obscured by the shadow of a faded baseball cap, but his steady gaze and calm demeanor were unmistakable. Name's Jack, he said simply, his voice even but polite. Officer Darren Brooks tilted his head slightly, assessing the man. Jack's calmness wasn't arrogance, but something else, something harder to pin down. Darren didn't like it. He was used to people reacting with nervousness or excuses, not this quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. What are you doing parked here? Darren asked again, his tone sharper. He gestured toward the truck. You're blocking the lane, creating a hazard for other drivers. Move it or I'll call a tow truck. Jack turned slightly, nodding toward his truck. Its hood was popped open, and a faint wisp of steam curled into the air. Just giving the engine a break, he said matter-of-factly. She overheated a few miles back. Needed to cool her down before I could keep going. Darren's eyes narrowed. Jack's explanation was reasonable, but the way he delivered it, a calm, unbothered tone, made Darren's jaw tighten. It felt dismissive, as though Jack didn't take the situation seriously. You can't just park on the shoulder like this, Darren pressed. It's dangerous. You're blocking part of the road. Move it now, or I'll have it towed. Jack hesitated, glancing at his truck for a long moment before turning back to Darren. His expression didn't change, but there was something about the way he held himself steady, deliberate, that put Darren on edge. Officer, Jack said slowly, I think you might want to check your facts before you make that call. Darren's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected that. The remark wasn't aggressive or disrespectful, but it was undeniably bold. A surge of irritation flared in Darren's chest. Who did this guy think he was? Do you think this is a joke? Darren asked, his voice hardening. He stepped closer, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. License and registration. Now. Jack sighed, the sound heavy with what could only be described as reluctant compliance. He reached into his back pocket, moving slowly and deliberately, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was his license, and tucked behind it, a neatly folded sheet of paper that looked like a vehicle registration form. Here you go, Jack said, handing them over without a hint of nervousness. His movements were steady, almost practiced, as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. Darren snatched the documents, his eyes darting over them quickly. "Stay here," he muttered, turning back toward his patrol car. Under his breath, he added, "This guy thinks he's above the law." As Darren walked away, he felt the heat of Jack's gaze on his back. He resisted the urge to glance over his shoulder. Something about Jack didn't sit right with him. He wasn't aggressive or openly defiant, but there was an unspoken confidence in the way he stood and spoke, a confidence that Darren found unsettling. Back at his patrol car, Darren slid into the driver's seat and opened his laptop. He entered Jack's name and license number into the database, fully expecting to find something: an unpaid fine, a suspended license, or maybe even a criminal record. It wasn't uncommon for people with an attitude like Jack's to have something to hide. But as the screen loaded, Darren frowned. Nothing came up. No tickets, no warnings, no arrests, just a clean, unremarkable record. Darren leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "That's odd," he muttered to himself. His eyes drifted back to the truck. Jack was still standing by the hood, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He wasn't fidgeting or pacing like most people did when stopped by the police. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he was waiting for something or someone. Darren shook his head, brushing off the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. He closed the laptop and grabbed the documents again, intending to give Jack a warning and send him on his way. But as he stepped out of the car, his gaze fell on the truck's windshield. Tucked under the wiper blade was a small, folded envelope. It hadn't been there when he first approached the truck, or at least, Darren hadn't noticed it. Curiosity prickled at the edges of his irritation, but he forced himself to focus. As he walked back toward Jack, he tightened his grip on the documents. "All right," Darren said, holding up the license and registration. "Everything checks out, but you still can't park here. Move it or I'll have to escalate this." Jack's eyes flicked to the documents, then back to Darren's face. "Escalated how, exactly?" he asked, his tone still calm. Darren stiffened. There was no challenge in Jack's voice, but the question hung in the air like a dare. Darren took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay professional. "I mean it," Darren said firmly. "This is your last warning." Jack tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "All right, officer," he said finally. "I'll move the truck as soon as it's ready." Darren frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jack gestured toward the hood. "The engine's still cooling down. If I start it now, it might overheat again. Give it 10 more minutes, and I'll be out of your way." Darren opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He glanced at the truck, the faint steam still rising from the engine. Technically, Jack had a point. Forcing him to start the truck before it was ready could cause more problems. "Fine," Darren said grudgingly. 10 minutes. But if you're still here when I come back, I'm towing it." Jack nodded, his calm smile returning. "Fair enough." As Darren turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something about Jack didn't add up. His truck might have been a simple case of engine trouble, but the way Jack carried himself, calm, confident, and almost too composed, suggested there was more to the story. And Darren intended to find out what it was. Darren returned to his patrol car, but his mind was buzzing. He couldn't shake the way Jack had looked at him, calm, unbothered, as if he had nothing to prove. It was unusual, almost unsettling. Darren was used to people being either defensive or overly apologetic during traffic stops. Jack didn't fit into either category. As he sat in his car, his gaze drifted back toward the truck. The envelope under the windshield wiper still caught his eye. Was it something important, or just junk mail? Normally, he wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something about Jack made him curious. 10 minutes, Darren reminded himself. That's how much time he'd given Jack to clear out. Until then, he could afford to sit and watch, maybe see if anything else seemed out of place. Jack, meanwhile, leaned against the side of the truck, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He wasn't pacing or checking his phone like most people would. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, seemingly lost in thought. Darren frowned. Who is this guy? He opened his laptop again, deciding to dig a little deeper. If Jack Roberts didn't have a record, maybe his truck would tell a different story. Darren entered the license plate number into the system, expecting to find something: expired tags, unpaid fees, anything that could explain why the man seemed so casual about being stopped. The search results came back quickly, but they weren't what Darren had expected. The truck was registered to Jack, as he'd claimed, but the details were sparse. No outstanding violations, no red flags. Just a simple record of ownership for an old vehicle that had clearly seen better days. Darren leaned back in his seat, frustrated. He wasn't sure what he'd been hoping to find, but this only deepened the mystery. Jack's truck was clean, his license was valid, and he didn't seem to be in any kind of trouble. So why did Darren feel like there was more to the story? His thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of his radio. "Brooks, everything all right out there?" It was dispatch, checking in. Darren hesitated before responding. "Yeah, just dealing with a stalled vehicle on Route 47, he said. "Need any assistance?" "No, I've got it under control," Darren replied quickly. He didn't want backup, not yet, anyway. Something about this situation felt personal, like he needed to figure it out himself. He set the radio aside and glanced at the clock. 4 minutes left. Jack still hadn't made a move to start his truck. Darren drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, debating whether to approach the man again or let the clock run out. His gaze flicked back to the envelope. It sat there, undisturbed, as if it were daring him to take a closer look. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. Darren stepped out of his car and approached the truck once more. Jack turned his head slightly, acknowledging him with a small nod but saying nothing. "What's in the envelope?" Darren asked, pointing to the windshield. Jack's expression shifted slightly, his calm demeanor taking on a hint of caution. "Nothing important," he said. Darren raised an eyebrow. "If it's nothing important, then you won't mind if I take a look?" Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening. For the first time, Darren saw a flicker of tension in the man's otherwise steady demeanor. "It's personal," Jack said after a moment. "Doesn't have anything to do with you, officer." Darren crossed his arms, his curiosity now fully piqued. "If it's personal, why leave it out in the open like that? Seems to me like you wanted someone to see it." Jack didn't respond immediately. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Sometimes, people leave things where they know they'll be found," he said finally. "Doesn't mean they want to talk about it." Darren studied Jack closely, his irritation momentarily giving way to intrigue. There was something in the man's tone, something heavy, almost regretful, that caught him off guard. But Darren wasn't the type to let things go. He reached for the envelope, pulling it free from the wiper blade before Jack could protest. "Hey!" Jack said sharply, stepping forward. Darren held up a hand. "Relax. If it's nothing important, then you've got nothing to worry about." Jack stopped, his shoulders tense. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but then he stepped back, shaking his head. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Darren unfolded the envelope, finding a single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't what he'd expected. There was no letter, no official document, just a list of names. The handwriting was neat but unpolished, and the names were written in 2 columns, each one followed by a short note in parentheses: Kia, missing in action, in recovery, homeless. Darren's stomach tightened as he scanned the list. It was long, at least 30 or 40 names, and every single one carried a note that hinted at some kind of hardship or loss. "What is this?" Darren asked, his voice quieter than he'd intended. Jack didn't answer right away. He leaned back against the truck, his gaze fixed on the horizon once more. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost distant. "They're people I served with," Jack said. "Friends, teammates, brothers." Darren blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Served? You mean?" Jack nodded. "Military. A long time ago." Darren looked back at the list, his mind racing. He'd heard stories about veterans, stories of sacrifice, loss, and the struggles they faced when they came home. But seeing the names written out like this, each one marked by a tragic footnote, made it feel more real than any story he'd ever heard. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Why carry this around?" he asked. Jack shrugged, but there was a weight to the gesture. "Because someone has to remember them," he said simply. Darren stared at Jack, unsure of how to respond. The man's calm demeanor suddenly made sense. It wasn't arrogance or defiance, but the quiet confidence of someone who had been through more than most people could imagine. He folded the paper back into the envelope and handed it to Jack. "I'm sorry," Darren said awkwardly, the words feeling inadequate. Jack took the envelope without a word, tucking it into his jacket. Darren glanced at the truck, then back at Jack. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, his tone softer now. Jack shook his head. "No, officer. I'll be on my way in a minute. Thanks for the patience." Darren hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Just take care of yourself." Jack smiled faintly. "You too." As Darren walked back to his patrol car, he felt a strange mix of emotions: curiosity, respect, and a lingering sense of guilt for the way he'd handled the situation. He sat behind the wheel, watching as Jack climbed into his truck and started the engine. The old vehicle roared to life, the steam now gone, and Jack pulled back onto the road without another word. Darren stayed parked for a long time after the truck disappeared from view, thinking about the list of names and the man who carried it. Sometimes, he thought, there's more to people than meets the eye. The sun cast long shadows across Route 47 as Officer Darren Brooks stared at his laptop screen, struggling to process what he'd just uncovered. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing. "Jack Roberts," he murmured to himself. The name wasn't just a name, it was attached to a service record that read like something out of a history book. Former Staff Sergeant. Multiple tours overseas. Medal of Honor recipient. Darren blinked, his throat tightening. He scrolled further, scanning the commendations and citations listed in Jack's record. The words leapt out at him: valor beyond the call of duty. Saved the lives of 20 comrades under fire. Risked his own life to shield civilians during an ambush. The more Darren read, the more uneasy he felt. The man leaning casually against the hood of that battered old truck wasn't just some laid-back driver giving his engine a break. He was a decorated war hero, someone who had faced horrors Darren could hardly imagine and come out on the other side. And yet here he was, standing on the side of a quiet highway, driving a truck that looked like it could break down at any moment. Darren leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell is he doing out here?" he muttered. He glanced toward the truck, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Jack Roberts didn't look like a man seeking attention or recognition. If anything, he seemed determined to keep a low profile. But why? The more Darren thought about it, the more questions swirled in his mind. Why hadn't Jack mentioned his service? Why was someone with such a storied past living this way? With a sigh, Darren closed his laptop and stepped out of the patrol car. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the truck again. This time, his demeanor was different. The irritation and suspicion from earlier had been replaced by something else: curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of respect. As he got closer, Darren's eyes caught a small detail he'd missed before. Sewn onto the sleeve of Jack's jacket was a faded patch. The colors were muted, almost blending into the worn fabric, but the insignia was unmistakable: a military emblem, a symbol of Jack's service. Darren cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. "Mr. Roberts." Jack turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, officer?" Darren hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. He gestured toward the patch on Jack's jacket. "I didn't realize you were military." Jack's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight straightening of his shoulders, a flicker of something in his eyes. "No need for formalities," Jack said, his tone calm. "Just a truck driver now." But Darren couldn't let it go. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Medal of Honor," he said softly. "That's not something you see every day." Jack let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Doesn't mean much now." Darren frowned. "I think it means a lot," he said. "It means you've done things most people can't even imagine." Jack shrugged, his gaze drifting back toward the horizon. "It's just a piece of metal," he said. "What matters is the people we lost getting it." Darren felt a pang of guilt for his earlier assumptions. This wasn't the defiant, arrogant man he'd imagined. Jack's calm demeanor wasn't born of pride or defiance, it was something deeper, something forged by experience and loss. "You don't talk about it much, do you?" Darren asked, his tone softening even further. Jack shook his head. "Talking doesn't change anything," he said. "Doesn't bring them back." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the sound of the wind and the faint hum of passing cars filling the space between them. Darren glanced at the truck again, his curiosity growing. "So, why this?" he asked, gesturing toward the rig. "Why drive a truck? Someone like you could do anything." Jack smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's honest work," he said. "Keeps me busy. Keeps my mind quiet." Darren nodded slowly, sensing there was more to the story. "And the list?" he asked, referring to the envelope he'd seen earlier. Jack's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time, Darren saw a crack in the man's composure. "They're the ones who didn't make it," Jack said. "Friends, teammates. People who deserved that medal more than I did." Darren felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. The weight of Jack's words hung heavily in the air, filling the silence with unspoken emotions. "They're the reason I do this," Jack continued, his voice quieter now. "Every mile I drive, every load I haul, it's for them. To honor their memory." Darren nodded, his respect for the man growing with each passing moment. "That's admirable," he said. Jack waved him off. "It's not about being admirable," he said. "It's about doing something, anything to keep moving forward." Darren studied Jack's face, searching for some hint of the man's inner struggles. He saw it now, the weariness in Jack's eyes, the way he carried himself with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "Look," Darren said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know what you've been through, but, if you ever need anything, there are people who can help. You don't have to do this alone." Jack smiled faintly, his expression tinged with a hint of gratitude. "I appreciate that, officer," he said. "But I've got everything I need." Darren wasn't convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "Just in case," he said, handing it to Jack. "That's my number. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call." Jack took the card, studying it for a moment before tucking it into his jacket. "Thanks," he said simply. Darren nodded, taking a step back. "I'll let you get back on the road," he said. "Just, take care of yourself, all right?" Jack smiled again, a genuine warmth in his expression this time. "You too, officer."